Our speaker tonight, Barnett Rubin, is director and senior fellow at the Center on International Cooperation of New York University's on the executive board of Human Rights Watch Asia. He's the author of 8 books, some on Afghanistan and going back to the Taliban era. He was senior advisor to Richard Holbrooke, who was President Obama's special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I was quite interested back in the waiting room talking to him, and he was explaining the relationship between Richard Holbrooke and Hamid Karzai, and I think if he talks about that this evening, you might find it quite fascinating. He has a PhD and an MA from the University of Chicago, so you get the picture. He has a pretty impressive CV, but when I was lucky enough to interview him, he also laid out the geopolitical situation in Afghanistan in a way that I found quite astonishing, talking about the role of China, of India, of Iran, of Pakistan, of these actors within Pakistan like LET, and then you've got the ISI. He's also been in the midst of some of the biggest decisions that were made in the world in the past decade involving Afghanistan. So you really have a front row seat to recent history, and it's my privilege to introduce Barney Rubin, and I hope you enjoy hearing what he has to say. Thanks.
Well, thanks a lot for coming out tonight. I just want to say, as first point, that I cannot see anything in front of me because of the lights that are illuminating me, but I'm told that as a result of those lights, you will be able to hear me better. I don't quite know how that works, but I can see that there are people out there. But certainly. The important thing is for the mic and me to be closer, whether it's through my moving or the mic. So I'll do that. It's my first time in Vancouver. I'm very pleased to be here. I appreciate the hospitality of SFU. Joe Howell, particular, who's personally responsible for bringing me here, because we met at the Jaipur Literature Festival in January. You still look like you're straining a bit. Can you hear me okay?
It will be a struggle.
Well, let's see if we can solve it. Okay. And I should also add that working in Afghanistan, for many decades, but particularly since 2001, I have encountered many Canadians in Afghanistan and outside. I've been to Canada several times, mostly to the usual, Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa triangle, and I really appreciated the work that they did there. And in particular, a Canadian friend of mine is here, Harjit Sajjan, who I got to know when he was on the ground as a reserve officer in Kandahar, and he contacted me after an article that I published. And we've been in 2006, and we've been in touch ever since, and it's really a great pleasure for me and an honor to see him on his home territory. And I understand he's involved in politics in Vancouver now, so I certainly wish him well with that. Before I got here, actually, I spoke to Charlie Smith by telephone, and some of you may have seen the interview that he did. It was published online in the Georgia Straight today. I guess the print edition will be out tomorrow? Tonight. Okay, it's out now. But anyway, it's already online. And one of the questions he asked me is something that I hadn't really been thinking about addressing, but I think I'll say a few words about it, which was a very simple question, but one that would naturally come in Canada, which is, was it worth it? Because I don't know the statistics exactly, but I do know that on a per capita basis, Canada had one of the highest rates of casualties of any of the troop-contributing countries. Certainly it became maybe the highest, actually. Perhaps Macedonia had the highest on a per capita, or Georgia on a per capita basis, but among the major troop-contributing countries, I think Canada had the highest rate of casualties. Certainly it spent a lot of money. I was always made aware in my visits to Ottawa that it was the top foreign policy priority for Canada in many respects, which it never was in the United States. And that's something Canada has in common with a few other countries like Norway, for instance, and some other European countries. And it's a question, was it worth it, that I can't answer for you. What I can say is that, on the one hand, the situation today in Afghanistan, judged comparatively by other countries, is still extremely bad. Poverty, low level of education, insecurity, violence, and so on. And I can also say that it's much better than it was 13 years ago. And I can say that, therefore, that we together accomplished some things, but I certainly cannot say that we didn't make mistakes and that everything we did was right. And if I say that overall I'd have to say it was worth it, it doesn't mean that necessarily every life that was sacrificed had to be sacrificed, or that every dollar, Canadian or American, that was spent there was spent well. Certainly that's not the case. But I'd like to talk a little bit tonight about what the various goals were, perhaps about mistakes that were made, but mistakes are always relative to goals. And I think one thing that we need to be much clearer about is that there were many actors involved. This is not unique to Afghanistan, of course. Those actors had different goals. Some of them made mistakes in how they pursued their goals, in the sense they didn't match the means to the ends. But it's also true that the actors had different goals. And very often, for instance, people will say we did something wrong in Afghanistan because it didn't contribute to the stabilization of the country or to building rule of law, and they may well be right about that. But the reason we did those things was often not because of intellectual error or faulty analysis, but because we weren't trying to build rule of law or democracy. We were trying to engage in counterterrorism. Now, we may have engaged in counterterrorism wrongly. Again, that depends on how you define terrorism. But I just wanted to unpack that a little bit more and say, so we can kind of understand the context in which things went partly right, partly wrong, and partly in ways that it's difficult to characterize. I'll just add one other thing, which is that when you are dealing with politics, especially in relatively liberal societies, you also have to enlist constituencies to support it. And in order to enlist support for this operation, political leaders evoked many goals which were not necessarily the essential goals of the operation. If you think on a very simple level, before the events of September 11th, Afghanistan was unstable, violent, had the highest rates of gender inequality in the world. By the way, it had that before the Taliban. That wasn't just because of the Taliban. Was not a democracy. So those were not the reasons we went into Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan because of a terrorist attack. And then we went from 100 million a year to 100 billion a year. That's not because Afghanistan became 1,000 times more dangerous or more oppressive. Yet, in building support for that operation, for instance, in the UK, the main emphasis was on counter-narcotics because so much of the drug problem in the UK is based on heroin that is originally refined from poppy that is produced in Afghanistan. In the United States and Canada, of course, a lot of the discourse about Afghanistan was about women's rights, democratization, and so on. And inevitably, of course, things have advanced on both of those scores a great deal, but the visionary ideas on which the operation was sold to some extent were always unrealistic. And I've found that sometimes those excessive expectations that were aroused by political leaders in order to gain support make it very difficult to make some of the difficult but necessary decisions that we have to do now. But I'll come back to all of that. But the contradiction among the various goals was built right into the structure of the settlement. When I say the contradiction of the goals, I mean between the essential goal, which is not a value judgment on my part, that's an analysis of why the United States and other countries were willing suddenly to spend so much resources, including the lives of their citizens, in a country that they didn't have strategic interest in earlier, was counterterrorism. And yet, once you finished the strictly counterterrorism part of destroying the al-Qaeda infrastructure in Afghanistan and the regime that had sheltered them, you had a problem. Afghanistan was not just a terrorist base, it was a country, approximately 30 million people living there, bordering on many very important regions of the world. What were you going to do with it? I might say anecdotally, I had something to do with that because at that time I was already at NYU where I am now. I'd been involved with Afghanistan for many years, partly as a consultant to the UN. And a couple weeks after 9/11, I got an email from one of my friends in the State Department saying, it was a very short email, but can you come here next Tuesday, 4 p.m., future of Afghanistan? And what had happened was that after about 10 days after 9/11, the Bush administration realized that after they had destroyed the Taliban and al-Qaeda, they still had to do something about this country, and what should they do? And Bush had run on a platform of no nation building and so on. But Colin Powell, who was then Secretary of State, had kind of got at least clearance from the White House to explore the option of political stabilization. So his director of policy planning, somebody I knew, Richard Haass, who's now the president of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, convened a meeting including both people from the government and several outside experts to discuss that. And that meeting kind of produced a consensus, a reluctant consensus on the part of some people in the administration, that the U.S. should also enlist the help of the United Nations to try to enable Afghanistan to have a political future, a reconstruction program, and so on. And I might add that one of the 4 or 5 non-governmental participants in that meeting was my then good friend and collaborator, Ashraf Ghani, who is now the president of Afghanistan, and at that time was an American citizen working for the World Bank, but who had also been working on the Afghan question together with me for many years, partly in consultation with the United Nations. Well, Ashraf and I were soon mobilized into that political process by Lakhdar Brahimi, the former foreign minister of Algeria, who became the UN special representative and who was in charge of convening a meeting to determine the political future of Afghanistan. And that was the meeting known as the Bonn Talks, the UN Talks on Afghanistan in Bonn, where I was an advisor to Ambassador Brahimi along with Ashraf Ghani. And the contradiction among the goals of the operation was in a way written right into the agreement. Because the first annex to the agreement was on the creation of a multinational force to help stabilize the cities of Afghanistan once they came under the control of the anti-Taliban forces. That's the force that later became known as the International Security Assistance Force. That's the force in which Canada played such an important role, both in the first few years when it was under ad hoc kind of leadership on every 6 months, and then after 2003 when it came under NATO leadership. And that force was defined as one that would provide security and train new security forces, initially in Kabul, the capital, and surrounding areas, but then expanding to other regions. And the idea was to prevent the various militias that had been mobilized by U.S. Special Forces and CIA and their allies to fight against the Taliban from coming into the cities, taking control of them, and essentially duplicating the situation in Afghanistan the previous decade, where there had been a civil war, militia control of the cities, and no possibility of civilian or nonviolent politics, right? Because all political groups were basically organized militarily, and politics was fighting. However, that was never really fully implemented, because there was another military operation on the ground at the same time. That was the one that was called Operation Enduring Freedom, which was the counterterrorism military operation. And the counterterrorism military operation was defined initially as destroying the bases of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, then overthrowing and destroying the Taliban regime, which had sheltered them. And remember, the principle that President Bush had enunciated was that those who shelter terrorists will get the same treatment as the terrorists themselves. That is, the two groups were equated. And that was the priority for the United States. Now, that in turn determined the role of the group of people whom you have heard referred to as warlords. Of course, no one is a warlord genetically. You can be a warlord at one time and then evolve into something else later. And quite a few of warlords in Afghanistan have evolved into politicians, and that is, of course, a very standard procedure in the history of state building. But they continued to function as warlords for some time, partly because ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, did not expand to provide an alternative source of security, but also because the U.S. forces engaged in counterterrorism activity was using them to assist in killing and capturing leaders of the Taliban, and to a much lesser extent al-Qaeda, because al-Qaeda had almost entirely fled to Pakistan at that time. Now, this is when we come to one of the so-called mistakes. I don't mean when I say so-called mistakes, I don't mean that it was right. I mean that perhaps the problem with it was not that it was a mistake, but there was a conflict among goals, which is that supporting unaccountable armed groups to fight is not a good way to establish the rule of law, democracy, stability for investment, and so on. But it might be a cost-efficient way of killing enemies and defeating terrorists, and that was what they were trying to do at the time. And in my experience, for government and also in government, whenever there was a conflict between the counterterrorism mission and the stabilization mission, generally speaking, the counterterrorism mission won, because that was the reason we were there. And stabilization took second place to it. And even today, when we are now getting out of combat, and of course a combat mission will be over by the end of this year, nonetheless we are keeping a small number of forces there, both to train and assist the Afghan military, but also for counterterrorism. And of course, we also have the drone program, which makes possible the targeting of people identified as terrorists or terrorist supporters, not only in Afghanistan, but also across the border in Pakistan. I'm sure we'll have time to discuss that more later. Of course, the United States' focus to some extent shifted from Afghanistan to Iraq. One of the other criticisms of U.S. policy at that time was that they lost the focus on Afghanistan, shifted resources to Iraq. That is true, and it left things in Afghanistan on autopilot for a while, but it's also true, and I'll come to this in a minute, that to some extent they were doing the wrong thing in Afghanistan, so doing it with more resources would not necessarily have helped. And the result of that was that just when the U.S. shifted forces and attention from Afghanistan to Iraq and was more positive and welcoming toward other countries, such as Canada, coming in to assist it in Afghanistan under the NATO umbrella, a much larger insurgency broke out, so that a mission, or escalated, so that a mission that many troop-contributing countries, and I think specifically Canada, had anticipated it would be a stabilization and development mission, turned instead into a counterinsurgency mission, which was something quite different from what you had bargained for. Now, let me explain why that happened. I think there are several reasons, but the most important reason was because of the way that the Bush administration, and I shouldn't just say the Bush administration, but much of the national security apparatus of the United States and then of other countries as well, and we can see this problem well beyond the United States as well, defined the problem of terrorism and defined how you take action against terrorism, the so-called war on terrorism. I mentioned that President Bush had taken the position that those who harbor terrorists would be treated the same way as the terrorists themselves. And in a sense, the word terrorist has a strong moral connotation, and it sort of comes along with this phrase, you don't negotiate with terrorists, even though that is not necessarily your policy. Nonetheless, the phrase has that baggage along with it. And I found that labeling groups as terrorists often is an obstacle to political analysis of what they are actually about. Now, the Taliban, for instance, the Taliban did not attack the United States. One of my earliest meetings in Washington after 9/11, I was invited by a member of Congress to come and and talk to several members of Congress over lunch. I think they were all Democrats because she was a Democrat. And I mentioned, not as something I was trying to inculcate in people, but I just mentioned as a fact that was relevant to the points I was trying to make, that the Taliban had not attacked the United States. And one of the members of Congress said, "What do you mean they didn't? Who did then?" So, and of course, from someone who was elected to Congress from Los Angeles, she never had to engage in analysis of the variety of Islamist groups in the South Asia and Middle East. That was quite irrelevant to her career path, and was not familiar with that. So I could try to explain it, but if from that perspective they didn't look that different. The fact is that the Taliban, while espousing many values that we find repugnant, first, they arose in a very different context. The Taliban did not originate in Afghanistan in order to destroy democracy and kick women out of school, because there was no democracy and there were no functioning schools in most of the areas where they arose originally. They arose in order to try to impose a very harsh version of Islamic law in order to reestablish a kind of order in a situation where order had broke down, when they took over urban areas where there was more education and more civic space. That had a very adverse effect on women, educated people more generally. There were ethnic aspects to it as well. But they never had an international terrorist agenda. They really didn't understand, in my view, the ideological and international goals of al-Qaeda. And by the way, they inherited al-Qaeda from others in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda didn't originally come to Afghanistan in order to ally with the Taliban. And they, like many people, I think including some people in Canada, Europe, and elsewhere, did not believe originally that al-Qaeda had actually carried out 9/11, and were not convinced that it was true just because the United States said so, or because it was broadcast on CNN. So it was difficult to negotiate with them about that right after 9/11, at a time when, of course, things were very emotional, and I was in New York the day it happened and saw much of it. It was, and there was irresistible political pressure on any U.S. government to react in some very forceful way. So probably there was not much latitude in what the initial response would be, but the Bonn Agreement was structured in a way, and here I'm certain about it because I was part of the UN team that helped to negotiate it and helped draft it, was structured in such a way as to take the meeting in Bonn, which was an unrepresentative group of Afghans, and provide a process which would enable those who weren't represented there, which meant, among others, the Taliban, to become involved in the creation of a new Afghan political order. For instance, within 6 months after the Bonn Agreement created an interim authority that Hamid Karzai was the head of. And that was just negotiated in that room in Bonn by these group of Afghans that we had assembled because they were available and belonged to various political groups. That interim authority had as its main task convening what was called an emergency loya jirga, or Great Council, within 6 months, which was to choose a more representative government, which would then preside over the drafting and adoption of a new constitution. Those of us in the UN at that meeting, and I think many of the Afghan participants, at least some of the Afghan participants, thought that once the war was concluded, the interim government was in place, then the Taliban could be invited into that process. We didn't know that they would all accept. However, some of them were willing to accept, and I might mention that the day after the Bonn Agreement was signed, the Taliban leadership and Hamid Karzai were in negotiations. Hamid Karzai was in a village called Shawalikot just outside of Kandahar. And the Taliban agreed to hand over the 4 provinces that they still controlled to the new government of Hamid Karzai without a fight, in return for promises of an amnesty, and in return for which they would give a ceasefire. They didn't surrender. They didn't say, we recognize your government, but they agreed to a ceasefire on the basis of an amnesty, and a number of them sent private messages to President Karzai, which is all pretty well documented now, and he also told me about it personally. But the United States stopped that because, again, that would have helped stabilize Afghanistan, but from the point of view of the United States, and the specific person who did this was Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, it would have sent the message that you can harbor terrorists and then get off scot-free. So he said, he gave a press conference, I found the text since then, where he said, we will not support any negotiated settlement, period. And therefore, they then developed a doctrine under which the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were both classified as terrorist targets, not everyone in the Taliban, but at least the leadership. And essentially, they established the camp in Guantanamo to send them to, as well as the prison in Bagram. And during those 6 months, from late December 2001 to June 2012, when the Taliban might have been invited to join the emergency loya jirga, they instead were being hunted, sent to Guantanamo and so on, and most of them escaped to Pakistan. So at that point, they were not able to be included in that process. Again, I don't mean this as a defense of anything the Taliban stand for. As you know, a political settlement involves allowing people to participate, not adopting their views or implementing them. That's all that this is about. Similarly, in the next couple of years, before the Constitution was adopted in 2004, the Taliban, who at that time were a defeated force, they saw themselves as having been defeated pretty decisively, also reached out again to the government, and there was a pretty active discussion in 2003 and 2004, but the U.S. government response was, well, you can reintegrate some of them if you want, but here's a list of 80 of their leaders who you can't talk to. That was the so-called blacklist, which eventually made it impossible for them to reach agreement. And at the same time, there was a regional element to this, which was, and I haven't talked about this thus far, Charlie referred to it earlier. Of course, the Taliban had partly been agents of Pakistani policy. That is, Afghanistan was situated among various regions. There were different countries seeking influence in it. Pakistan, which had lost some of its territory and much of its population to India in the war that took place in 1971 and 72, resulting in the independence of Bangladesh, which had a long-standing dispute with India over the rulership of Kashmir and many other issues, was concerned that Afghanistan would become a base for pro-Indian forces. That's part of the reason that Pakistan had enthusiastically supported the war against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, because the Soviet Union was seen as allied with India, and the U.S. and Pakistan at that time were on the same side. After the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed. Pakistan was concerned that the vacuum in Afghanistan would be filled by India, Russia, or Iran, and they supported the Taliban as a force that would not ally with those groups. In 2001, Pakistan was quite marginalized from the regional and diplomatic picture in Afghanistan because they had been allied with the Taliban. But they had their entree back in because the U.S. had to rely on Pakistan for access to Afghanistan, which is a landlocked country. We don't have a map here. Maybe at a minimum I should have asked to have a map here. But Afghanistan is a landlocked country. It has no access to the sea or to international airspace except through Pakistan, Iran, Central Asia, or about a 10-kilometer border with China. Given the relations between the United States and Iran at that time, the only way that the United States could transport troops economically into Afghanistan and supply them was through Pakistan, which was also the way that U.S. had supplied its policy in Afghanistan during the 1980s and so on. There's a northern route which is possible through Russia and Central Asia, which is being used today to some extent, but it's much longer politically, and they did use that too. They established some bases in Central Asia, but it is much longer, more difficult, and more expensive in many respects. So Pakistan, which was in many respects the source of the problem, became also the a essential part of what the United States saw as the solution. And it became, even though it was in many respects the source of the terrorism problem, it became the main partner in counterterrorism, particularly because al-Qaeda was on their territory. And there is a very cynical or realist analysis of Pakistani policy, which is that, in fact, the Pakistan military in particular wanted this situation because unless the United States needed Pakistan for something very important like counterterrorism in Afghanistan, it wouldn't support the military in Pakistan because otherwise their interests did not converge very much. At any rate, the United States at that time, and this is partly where the distraction with Iraq came in, focused mainly on getting Pakistan's consent for the military operations in Afghanistan, on some cooperation against al-Qaeda, and did not focus on Pakistan's national security concerns, some reality-based and some not so much reality-based, in Afghanistan and the regional situation around Afghanistan, kind of neglected what Pakistan was doing, and went off to Iraq. So by the end of the Bonn process, which was in 2005 when the Afghan parliament was elected, Pakistan was convinced it would be marginalized, and the Taliban were convinced that they wouldn't have a place in the Afghan polity. Oh, there is a map there. How do you like that? When did that happen? Okay. Je vous remercie. And I remember I was in Afghanistan early 2006 working on the National Development Strategy, and I suddenly had the sense that things were going wrong. And I believe, Harjit, that you were in Kandahar about the same time, having somewhat the same sense. And I started thinking about why that was, which is why I started writing an article that later led Harjit to write me an email, which is how we got acquainted. But what happened was that as a result of both the political dynamic of not including the Taliban and the diplomatic dynamic of not taking account of Pakistan's, however you look at it, either its national security interests in Afghanistan or its malign intent, however you want to judge it, was that in 2006, the insurgency really took off in Afghanistan. And Canada was caught right in the middle of that because Canada had been given the primary responsibility for the southern region with the headquarters in Kandahar. And one of the first things that the Taliban did in launching that major insurgency was to attempt to seize the city of Kandahar, which led to the Canadian-led Operation Medusa, which now Lieutenant Colonel Harjit Sajjan played an important role in as an intelligence officer at that time. But at that time, the military on the ground, as well as the political people, really didn't understand what was behind that insurgency, were surprised by it. So let me talk a little bit about what was behind it. Not so much, I've explained kind of the political background about the marginalization of the Taliban leadership, Pakistan, but you cannot mount an insurgency on the ground unless you have a certain degree of public support. Now, public support doesn't mean the same thing in a war-torn country that it means in a peaceful, democratic country. It doesn't mean that people looked at the Taliban manifesto and decided that they preferred their policies over others, because they didn't have such a manifesto, and the government didn't have such a manifesto, or if it did, neither manifesto just actually described their behavior. They looked at, first of all, what they needed to do to survive. That's the number one priority. And second, what those two organizations, as they actually existed, rather than what policies they enunciated, were actually doing on the ground. And what the government of Afghanistan, or what the power holders of the government of Afghanistan were doing on the ground, really had relatively little to do with the democratic constitution they had adopted, and had a lot to do with how we were carrying out our military operations and how we were spending money. Because, and here's something I should have mentioned earlier, just to remind you, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's the poorest country in Asia, by far. Its statistics on domestic product, literacy, life expectancy, disease, gender equity, etc., are all more similar to the lower end of the spectrum of African countries than to other countries in Asia. And yet, you put in a large military operation, as I mentioned, an expenditure on the order of $100 billion a year. Not that went mainly to Afghanistan, of course, mainly went to the bureaucracies of the countries that were there. Nonetheless, they were spending huge amounts of cash there, much larger than the GDP of Afghanistan, actually, hiring people in private security companies, funding the government, procuring vehicles, fuel, all of those things that militaries have to do to survive. And how did they do that? They got there, they didn't know people. They made contacts through the elites that they knew, and I won't go into details here, but on the national level, they made contact initially with the power holders of northern Afghanistan, who had been suppressed by the Taliban. Those are the more well-known warlords, by and large. And so Kabul was taken over initially largely by militias from northern Afghanistan, largely belonging to the Tajik ethnic group, which created one set of problems. In southern Afghanistan, there was largely Pashtun tribal society, which is organized in a very unclear but yet hierarchical way. And because of the history of the area, there were some tribes that had much closer ties to the West because they were privileged in the old regime. Their kids got to go to school in the West. They became refugees in the United States or somewhere else. And when the United States came back, a lot of the contacts were through those people and those tribes. So you'll find that there were 3 or 4 tribes in Kandahar that got most of the contracts, most of the money. Hamid Karzai belonged to one. His main rival, Gul Agha Sherzai, belonged to another. They got most of the contracts, most of the money. They controlled the private security. They controlled most of the guns, whether through the security forces or through the private security agencies. And they used those in their self-interest as well, taking land, using the counterterrorism policies in vengeance against their rivals or their enemies. And probably the main driver of the insurgency in the South was vengeance, a revenge against the victimization of marginalized parts of the population by what we thought were counterterrorism operations, but in many cases got the wrong victims because we were getting our intelligence through these tribal networks and were caught up in these local struggles that we did not understand. That was one factor. When I say vengeance, also bear in mind that in a tribal, of course, for us, vengeance sounds very bad, and I'm not supporting it, but in a tribal society where the state is very weak, where there are not institutionalized legal methods of redress for crime, revenge is the system of justice, or it's a very important part of the system of justice. So the alternative to revenge is not rule of law. The alternative to revenge is impunity. Okay, so in a sense, when the institutions are so underdeveloped, revenge is an approach to rule of law. So there's a strong code of ethics in support of the concept of revenge as a form of justice, not bloodthirstiness, but justice. It's very hard for us to grasp sometimes. Second, once they came into power, of course, there were abuses of power, confiscation of land, misappropriation of development projects, and so on. So the marginalized sectors of the population were susceptible to recruitment by this other disenfranchised force and made it much more powerful than it would have been. Most of the support that the material support the Taliban received in southern Afghanistan was not based on support of their policies, in particular not based on support of the policies that they're most known for in the West, like closing down girls' schools and so on, which don't have that much support, but with the fact that they were enabled these disadvantaged parts of society to make a stand against the foreigners and the elites that were victimizing people. So in a way, the definition of the problem and the cause of the conflict, as was seen by our international mission and as seen by the people on the ground, were quite different. I just add, parenthetically, because of course I know some of you were thinking about drugs. Also, economically, Afghanistan had become a kind of war economy in the past several decades. That was exacerbated by this. A war economy means an economy that runs on money which is attracted in order to fund violence, and which then keeps on operating because of the way that violence is used in predatory ways to protect criminal economic activities like drugs and other forms of smuggling and used to extract resources from people. And, of course, one of the big failures of the mission is that we have not reduced the drug economy in Afghanistan. But it's an illusion to think that we can keep the whole war economy going with our massive infusions of money and the corruption that it generates and violence and so on, while eliminating one particular part of the war economy. The drugs is part of this violence-fueled economy of insecurity, and it can be diminished only when there's a degree of security. Now, when I came into the administration in 2009, I came in with pretty much this analysis of what the problem was, and started to work on it. I don't mean I did this by myself. I wouldn't be in the administration if I was by myself. I was hired by Richard Holbrooke, who was very close to Hillary Clinton, and of course President Obama made the whole thing possible by getting elected, which is something I would not know how to do, especially if my middle name were Hussein, and my father was born in Kenya. So obviously he knows something that I don't, even if sometimes I felt that he didn't do everything I would like. And so we started to work on, first, the definition of terrorism and counterterrorism. The first point was to try to say that Taliban and al-Qaeda are not the same. Well, there's a lot of institutional resistance to this because there's a whole apparatus of the war on terrorism that is built up around that, Guantanamo, laws, terrorist designations, and so on. I won't go into all of that. And it is still a problem or an obstacle. But even among those who admitted that there was a distinction, there were, roughly speaking, two different approaches. One approach is the one that's come to be identified, I don't know how accurately, with Vice President Biden, and that is Taliban are nasty. Many people in Afghanistan are nasty. We can't control the domestic politics of Afghanistan. All we should be concerned about is people who are going to attack the United States. So we should get our troops out of Afghanistan as fast as we reasonably can, let Afghanistan take its path, but make sure we have counterterrorism assets such as drones that we can use for targeting against al-Qaeda and other international terrorists, something like that. The other view was if the Taliban are different from al-Qaeda, then conceivably, and this was also the view of the Afghan government, they could be included in a political settlement, which would then mean we would have a much stronger, more legitimate, and more capable local partner, and that al-Qaeda would lose its local allies, which enabled it to operate in South Asia. But that was, and that is now the policy of the United States, and it's the policy of the Afghan government, though there are many frictions around it. But it was quite difficult to get there, and there's still a lot of resistance, besides, of course, that the Taliban didn't surrender the moment you offered them an opportunity to join a political process. Second, and one of the reasons they couldn't do that was because of the regional situation, we needed to address the regional issues that destabilized Afghanistan. First of all, first thing that the administration did was created a joint office of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is what I worked for, the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And that was to be sure that we had, well, I won't say be sure that we had, and that was to attempt to establish a coordinated strategy toward those two countries, whereas generally speaking, in the past you had different country teams that tended to adopt a very different perspective of those two capitals. That led to greater attention, much greater attention, to the Pakistan dimension of the Afghan problem of Afghanistan's insecurity, and of course recognition of the fact that there are actually more terrorists headquartered in Pakistan than there are in Afghanistan. And that has to do with the way that the Pakistan military has used unofficial armed groups as an instrument of asymmetrical power against larger opponents or enemies such as India, Russia, or even at times the United States. On one hand, but then again, there were several different approaches. There are those who, and I think the Afghan government under President Karzai was very much of this mind, who said, well, in that case, Pakistan's the enemy. And you should designate Pakistan as the enemy. And President Karzai often said, why are you carrying out military operations in Afghanistan? The terrorists are in Pakistan. The other approach, which was the one taken by our office, which was often which is sometimes misunderstood as pro-Pakistani, was to think, well, it's true that we in Pakistan have different interests, and Pakistan is doing many things that are very damaging to our interests, and we could even use much harsher language about what Pakistan is doing. But it is doing them for some reasons, even if reasons we don't sympathize with. So let's try to create a political process to see if we can get Pakistan to define what its national interests are, and if there's some way that it can be made to feel secure without resorting to the use of terrorism and so on. So we had a policy of diplomatic engagement with Pakistan. I won't say it succeeded, but I will say that over the past 5 years, there's been a tremendous change in the type of discussion that Pakistan is having with both the United States and with the government of Afghanistan. There's no longer just a politics of denial. And in fact, that's become one of the focuses of the policy of the new government of Afghanistan. You may have seen that President Ghani went to Pakistan last week. He had very high-level talks, which I understand went very positively, and they're relatively optimistic that there might be some change. Now, part of the reason for that is because of macro-scale changes in the region as a whole. Now, one of the questions people ask is, will Afghanistan, and this is related to the way I composed the title for the talk tonight. After the Soviet Union withdrew from its troops from Afghanistan in 1989, the state collapsed, there was a civil war, terrorists formed bases there. Will the same thing happen when American troops leave? Now, one of the reasons that happened after Soviet troops left was because there was no other actor at that time, or set of actors, that had both the interest and the means to stabilize Afghanistan, either through the use of coercion of some sort or through the provision of incentives, because of what the region was like at that time. Now, recently, I've been to China quite a few times in the last couple of years. I went to Shanghai. I don't know if anyone here has been to Shanghai. There's a river in the middle of Shanghai, and old Shanghai is on one side, and on the other side is an area called Pudong. Now, in 1989, Pudong was farmland. Today, Pudong is a modernistic financial center which was used as the set of the modernistic, of the hyper-modernistic scenes of the movie Her, if any of you have seen it, and is one of the major financial centers of the world. So China, for instance, has gone from being a poor, inward-looking, primarily agrarian country defining its foreign policy as protecting its borders, to an economic dynamo which is looking for resources, looking for regional connectivity, and also which is concerned about its internal stability, especially as affected by Islamic militancy because of the protests and some terrorist actions that have taken place in the Uyghur Autonomous Region of Xinjiang in western China. At the same time, less prominent but still important, India's economy has also taken off and has gone from the so-called Hindu rate of growth of 3.5% a year to an average of twice that over that period of time. And as both China and India's economies have taken off, the economic ties between China and India have also increased. It now means that the regional situation is quite different. I was involved in a set of Track 1, Track 2, and Track 1.5 that is unofficial but involving official participants, discussions about Afghanistan in a regional context for several years. And one of the things the Turkish participant used to talk about was how something called stability pacts in the Balkans. Now, one of the ways that the Balkans, Southeast Europe, and Central Eastern Europe were stabilized was by offering those countries, as they were coming out of the Soviet sphere of influence, or even the Soviet Union itself in some cases, the incentive of joining the European Union, or in some cases NATO, if they could adopt certain practices and standards and resolve their conflicts with each other. For instance, Hungary and Slovakia had to resolve differences over the Hungarian minority in Slovakia in order to join the European Union and NATO. And that was a huge incentive because of the huge market and potential for people to benefit from that. There was no such incentive or power of attraction in this region. Now there might be, because of the economic takeoff of China and India. Now, this will require tens of billions of dollars of investment in infrastructure in order to connect Afghanistan and the countries around it in some kind of economic integration. But we have discovered that Afghanistan is extremely rich in mineral resources, and that there is a demand for those mineral resources, not only globally, but in the countries around it. China has now announced a policy of establishing a Silk Road economic belt from China west through Central Asia. And they won't be able to do that if there's instability in Afghanistan and Central Asia. It's announced a plan to build a China-Pakistan economic corridor south from western China through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean, which could be connected to Afghanistan or even to India. And in discussions with the Chinese, they have talked about U.S.-China cooperation to extend that economic cooperation to Afghanistan as well. Now, Pakistan and China have very close relations. Each one is, in a sense, the closest ally of each other. And they talk about how it's higher than the mountains, wider than the seas, et cetera. And therefore, of course, the United States is also important to Pakistan, but the two countries don't trust each other. And if the United States suggests something to Pakistan, they will be very suspicious. But Pakistan absolutely needs China and trusts China. And now there's more of a convergence between Chinese interests and American interests, and Pakistan and China and the United States are talking about cooperating in Afghanistan. Now, that puts limits on the extent to which Pakistan can support destabilization in Afghanistan, and actually gives Pakistan, for the first time, a real economic incentive to try to stabilize Afghanistan, because China will invest in the infrastructure that might enable it to benefit from that. India might be concerned about being marginalized by that, is concerned. But again, I don't know if you noticed, there was very soon after Prime Minister Modi took office, there was a state or official visit by President Xi Jinping to Delhi. And two countries talked about cooperation. And very importantly, President Xi Jinping of China did not go to Pakistan on that visit. He wanted to go to Pakistan to signal its importance, but his security people wouldn't let him because they said it wasn't safe. But nonetheless, he did go to India. That's a sign, again, that the power relations are changing. And I know from my experience in the U.S. government that China asked us privately if the United States could organize some forums in which China could talk to India about Afghanistan without it looking like it was coming from China. That, in turn, is why the first state visit that President Ghani made after taking office a little more than a month ago was a state visit to China. And that state visit was followed by a very important regional meeting about Afghanistan, which China chaired. That is, so China is not going to replace the United States. They can't, and they don't want to. But they are now talking about, strangely enough, in view of their relations in other parts of the world, some kind of cooperation between the United States and China, along with other regional countries, in stabilizing Afghanistan, which might in turn provide the incentives for Pakistan to play a more positive role. Now, therefore, the elements of the strategy that we started to try to put together in 2008, 2009 might be starting to come together now. That does not eliminate all the tremendous vulnerabilities that Afghanistan has. It cannot pay for its own government. It cannot pay for its own security forces. Therefore, if something happens in the U.S. Congress or in some other foreign parliaments that leads to a significant decrease of funds, there's a danger that the government will collapse. No matter how much money we pour into it, if the political elites cannot reach sufficient consensus about how to govern the country, then we won't be able to continue. And that nearly happened after the presidential election. And the reason that those two candidates, Dr. Abdullah Abdullah and Dr. Ashraf Ghani, finally managed to reach some kind of agreement, which they haven't yet been able to implement, was because they understood that if they did not, then there wouldn't be any government, because the international community would not support them anymore, and they wouldn't be able to pay their troops, and et cetera. So I certainly would be the last person to say that things are going well, mission accomplished, and now Afghanistan is going to be stable. No. But there is now an alignment of forces in the region which gives us a strategy to move forward. I think that Afghanistan is not necessarily going to follow the route of West Asia, as of the Arab East, as it is also called, Iraq, Syria, and so on. So far, the so-called Islamic State has been making overtures to various groups in South Asia, and some groups are receptive to it, because some groups are always receptive to a new powerful organization that has money and arms and that can provide them with some resources. But I don't believe there's any appetite in the region to be ruled by an Arab government based somewhere in the Middle East. So I wouldn't. There will be new forms of extremism and other forms of other problems, but I don't envisage that being it by myself. So I won't say that I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful, and I believe that the new government in Afghanistan and its international partners have a way forward, which maybe we wouldn't want to bet our life savings on, but gives us something to work with. Thank you.
Pull up your microphone right here, and I'll ask a few questions of Barney, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. The first thing I wanted to ask you was, we in Canada have heard for many years about the ethnic tensions in Afghanistan with the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Hazara and the Pashtuns, and I'm wondering how much of a barrier that is to achieving long-term stability in Afghanistan.
I wouldn't say it's a barrier in the sense that there's no country that is completely homogeneous. Actually, one of the most ethnically homogeneous countries in the world is Somalia. But that doesn't mean they haven't had trouble establishing a political authority. When there is political conflict in Afghanistan, as there is, it can easily take on an ethnic form. But interestingly, there's not a single separatist movement in Afghanistan. There are many conflicts about the division of power, how the country should be ruled, even conflicts that could rise to the level of civil war. But those are all about how to rule the country rather than about whether it should exist.
Okay, now you were working with Richard Holbrooke, who was very close to Hillary Clinton. And when I read a book, Pakistan on the Brink by Ahmed Rashid, that he was saying that there was tremendous tension within the U.S. government between, first of all, he portrayed President Obama as being somewhat disengaged with Afghanistan, and then he went on to say the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head there, Mike Mullen at the time, was having real issues with the people in the State Department who wanted to negotiate with the Taliban. Can you explain what it was like? Because you were in the middle of all of that.
Well, I would answer that question about similarly to how I answered the question about ethnic tensions in Afghanistan, which is to say that there is no administration in which there weren't tensions among the White House, the State Department, and the Defense Department. In this case, maybe they took on a somewhat different form. The military is not it's not a warmongering organization. They actually don't like to get into wars. But once they are in a war, they are structured to try to win it. And you can kind of understand that, because if you're actually sacrificing lives and blood, and commanders feel tremendous responsibility for those young men and women under their command who are sacrificing, I'm sure Canadians will understand that. They are reluctant to agree that those sacrifices should be for the sake of negotiating points or something less than victory, though that sometimes is a political reality. Well, I was in the middle of a lot of those conflicts. Of course, a lot of it's appeared in the press. Obama's leadership style. I had supported President Obama in the election, not Hillary Clinton, but my personal relationship was with Richard Holbrooke, who asked me to join the government very generously, I might add, because I had not supported the candidate that he was working for. So I saw many of those conflicts up close. One of the things I learned, if it's true, at least I concluded, I can only say I learned it if it's true, but I concluded, is that political leaders who are dealing with a broad variety of issues, and specifically the President of the United States, have to rely on people they trust. They cannot rely per se on expertise, because you may have noticed that experts disagree among themselves as much as they do with anyone else. They just do so in more depth and more virulently. So a president has to be advised by people whose judgment and knowledge he trusts which experts to listen to. And Obama, because he had not been around for that long, had a relatively small team and was not really, and I felt anyway, didn't really know exactly which experts he should listen to. Of course, I had a very strong opinion about that. I thought he should listen to me. But he didn't know me, and the people who did know me were not close to him. So there was a problem with sort of getting our views up to the level of the White House. There was also a personal problem between Richard Holbrooke and the White House, and very sadly, when Richard died in December 2010, a number of policy issues were resolved because the personal issue was no longer in the way.
There's a lot of speculation that Hillary Clinton might become the next president. How would she deal with foreign affairs differently than President Obama?
Well, I'm in the circumstance now of someone who is tempted to answer a question because it has been posed to him, despite the feeling that I don't have a very good answer.
Did you talk about Afghanistan or Pakistan?
Yeah, well, no. In general, I would say that at least in my working with her or for her as Secretary of State, sometimes she appeared to have somewhat more confidence in the judgment of the national security apparatus than President Obama did. Although I must say that she showed a great deal of skepticism of all parts of government as well, and had her own independence of judgment. Now, in a number of policy areas, she was more inclined to use military force. Certainly that's been reported about Syria. She voted for the authorization to use force in Iraq. Obama says he was against it, though he wasn't in the Congress at that time, so we don't actually know how he would have voted if he had been called upon to do so. However, she is tremendously experienced in government and does have a team, so I imagine that her administration would be quite coherent and energetically run. But she has been quite risk-averse. Now, what I don't know is whether that risk aversion is simply because she's waiting to run for president and doesn't want to be implicated in anything like supporting a deal with Iran, making a complex Israeli-Palestinian agreement, negotiating with the Taliban, and so on, before she becomes president, and then perhaps after becoming president, if she did, she would be more daring or not. That I have no way of judging.
And can you describe, because you know both of them, Ashraf Ghani, it sounds like you know very well, the new president of Afghanistan, and Abdullah, who reached that agreement. What are those two personalities like, and what does that mean for where Afghanistan is going?
Now, this is just between the two of us, right?
Yeah, of course. We're just having a conversation.
Well, they're two different, very, very different personalities and from different backgrounds. What I think they have in common, and I've known one of them, Ashraf Ghani, for 30 years, and Dr. Abdullah, I think perhaps I have known for only 20 or 25 years, is that they have devoted themselves very single-mindedly to a national cause. And I've also found both of them to be extremely consistent over the years. That is, generally speaking, what they said yesterday is an excellent predictor of what they will say tomorrow, which was not always the case with Hamid Karzai. Of course, Ashraf Ghani is from a kind of Pashtun aristocratic family. He has a PhD from the United States. He was an official of the World Bank. He was an official of the United Nations. He was a candidate for Secretary General of the United Nations. He was a candidate for presidency of the World Bank. He is the author of a well-known book about repairing failed states, and is generally a figure. He was named one of the 100 global thinkers. He was named the best minister of finance of Asia one year when he was finance minister of Afghanistan. He has a tremendous international profile, tremendous intellect, and drive, and I've heard that he does not allow the people working for him these days to sleep, and is very determined to get things done, and has been very fast out of the gate doing things, and he's got a clear vision. He does suffer, to some extent, the disadvantage of having been an emigre, which is not his fault. Most of his relatives were arrested, and some of them were killed, so I cannot really fault him for not going back to the country. But and he certainly made the most of his time out on behalf of Afghanistan. But Dr. Abdullah was serving in Afghanistan with Ahmad Shah Massoud, which gives him more. The commander was giving him more prestige with some parts of the population. He is much more less of a visionary himself. I don't think his ideas really are not that different from Ashraf Ghani's, but the environment within which he works is one of leading a coalition of power holders, who many of whom view him as working for them rather than him as leading them. And in a way, he might have more political autonomy in this agreement with Ashraf Ghani than he would if he were president by himself. So I think he will have an important role in bringing some of the former fighters and so on into the fold. And we just have to see if those two people of somewhat similar visions but very different backgrounds will be able to bring their potentially complementary assets and endowments into a kind of team that can work together.
That's interesting. One of the things Canadians were surprised at was Osama bin Laden being found in Abbottabad, a military town, and it was hard for many of us to understand how he could be living there for so many, presumably for quite a while, without the knowledge of the government of Pakistan. And I'm wondering how damaging that has been to the level of trust with Pakistan, even in light of, there's the new prime minister.
I think many people in the United States government were not tremendously surprised to find that Osama bin Laden was living in Abbottabad, a Pakistani military town. And that indicates where the level of trust already was beforehand. So I don't know that that caused it to deteriorate. The fact that the United States decided to attempt to capture him and ultimately to kill him without notifying the government of Pakistan and making them their partner definitely caused a deterioration in relationships between the two governments, which I happen to have experienced firsthand. As I was actually in Afghanistan when Osama bin Laden was killed, and went to Pakistan the next day with my then boss, Ambassador Mark Grossman, who was the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Actually, the day after we met with the Prime Minister and several other. The government was still in a bit of shock, and most people hadn't realized that it had been done without informing Pakistan. So the backlash came a little bit later. But that was of course, that took place in May 2011. That whole year of 2011 was a series of shocks to U.S.-Pakistan relations that badly damaged them. On the other hand, I would say that those series of shocks forced us to confront what the relationship actually is, and the fact that there's some people who might say, well, Pakistan has betrayed us, they played a double game, etc. I would say we have recognized that Pakistan's national interests, as interpreted especially by the military, and the U.S. national interests, which of course are interpreted differently by different parts of the U.S. political spectrum, are quite different. And on that basis, we can have a more honest discussion. I think that since then, also, Pakistan has come under a lot more pressure from its own domestic terrorists and pressure from China, as I mentioned in the talk, which sees terrorists based in Pakistan now as a threat to China in ways that are forcing its elite to re-examine some of its assumptions.
Okay, I'll take questions in a moment. My last question will be about the drone attacks. And some of us look at these drone attacks and wonder if that just creates a more powerful insurgency and actually fuels, say, the Taliban within Pakistan and makes life even more difficult for the elected government of Pakistan. What are your thoughts about the drone attacks?
Drones are a weapon. And I wouldn't generalize about drone attacks as having a specific effect any more than I would generalize about rifle shots or bombs dropped from airplanes. It depends on the political context, where they might be. Any one of those weapons can be used in accord with the laws of war or to commit war crimes. Same is true for drones. My impression, first of all, there's a lot of bad faith about drones because a lot of the drone program was actually carried out from bases inside Pakistan with the knowledge and consent of the government of Pakistan. At a certain point, the United States started using drones unilaterally without talking to Pakistan. Among the drone strikes, there are different categories. I don't want to get too technical here, but I'll just say, bottom line, I haven't evaluation. Speaking to people about the drone strikes in Pakistan, as I have done, you get a much more mixed and complex picture than you do in the debate here. I'd note there's an article in this week's edition of the New Yorker magazine by Steve Cole, which captures some of this rather well. I found that in Pakistan there's tremendous resentment against the drone strikes, in particular by people living in areas that are not affected by the drone strikes, who see them as nothing more than a violation of Pakistani sovereignty. In discussions with people who live in the tribal agencies where the drone strikes take place, I have found actually a much more mixed and ambivalent reaction, because they're suffering from the drone strikes, yes, but they're also suffering from the terrorists who are killed by the drone strikes. So I once had this odd situation. I was at a meeting with some parliamentarians in Pakistan from the tribal agencies, and they all said, not very convincingly, that they were against the drone strikes and so on. And then one of them passed me a note. He said, "We all have to talk this way for reasons that I'm sure you understand, but we also know that the drones are the most effective way of eliminating the terrorists." Now, and because bear in mind that the people living in the tribal agencies are suffering tremendously from the rule of the Pakistani Taliban and some of the foreign terrorist organizations. Now, that doesn't really make them, that doesn't really console them when their family members are killed in drone strikes. And there are more civilian victims in drone strikes than our government has sometimes admitted, though also that number appears to have decreased significantly. My basic impression is that just in terms of effectiveness, the drone strikes were relatively effective against the leadership of Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, because that is an organization which did not recruit from the local population. They were mainly Arabs and people from other countries who were living there. And actually, the drone strikes alienated the local people from them because it caused them damage. It doesn't have quite the same effect when it's used against groups that are actually rooted in the local population, perhaps as against the Pakistani Taliban in Yemen and in Somalia, where the civilian casualties, I try to avoid euphemisms like collateral damage, where killing innocent people unintentionally has, again, arouses that response of revenge as a form of justice that I referred to earlier, and may, in fact, spread the insurgency.
Okay, do we have any questions from the audience? Gentleman right here.
Thank you. And is this on?
Yep.
First of all, Dr. Rubin, Canada has the highest concentration of ownership of media in the entire G7, so we received very bad information about this war, and I want to thank you for bringing us some more. I appreciate it. Couple of things. There are 30 million Afghans and 30,000 Taliban, so they're outnumbered 1,000 to 1. Why don't they just kill them? Also, the fellow by the name of Abdul Rasad Sayaf, I understood was a gentleman who invited Osama bin Laden into Afghanistan, and then I see his name running for parliament in this last election. Just how corrupt is this country? And thirdly, was TAPI ever a real thing, or was it just thrown around? Is it ever going to happen?
Okay, so we got 3 questions. You can answer them all, or? Thank you.
There was TAPI and SAYAF. TAPI and SAYAF. What was the first one?
Why there's 30,000
yes,
Taliban
okay.
and 30 million Afghans.
It's not that there are 30,000 Taliban. Maybe there are 30,000 armed men fighting for the Taliban at any one time. But thousands and thousands of them have been killed, and there's still 30,000 of them fighting. So it means that they have more support, and they can keep recruiting and replacing their fighters. So it's a political problem. It cannot be solved by military means. Military means are a part of it, but it cannot be solved by killing. And again, it comes back to what I said earlier, because the Taliban are part of Afghan society. If there were 30,000 radical Arabs from Saudi Arabia or Sudan or wherever fighting in Afghanistan without connection to Afghan society, then you could conceivably kill them all or expel them, because they couldn't replace themselves. But that's not the case with the Taliban. They're part of Afghan society, and they have to be addressed politically. SAYAF was a leader of Abdur Rabah Rasul Sayyaf, who is today, I don't know if he is now, he was the chair of the Foreign Relations Commission of the Afghan parliament, was the leader of one of the more fundamentalist Mujahideen groups in the 1980s, and he ended up being on the anti-Taliban side for various reasons. I don't think it's true that he was the one who brought Osama bin Laden to Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden came actually first to Pakistan in the 1980s as part of a loosely run joint U.S., Saudi, Pakistani, Chinese, British operation as the private sector part of that. He linked up with, he was part of an organization of Arab Mujahideen. He linked up with a couple of Afghan Mujahideen leaders, of whom Sayyaf was one. Bin Laden left Afghanistan and Pakistan after the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989. He first went to Saudi Arabia, then he was expelled from there. He went to Sudan. He was expelled from Sudan in 1996 under pressure from the United States and Egypt. And then he came back to Afghanistan and settled in and flew back to an area in eastern Afghanistan, which was not controlled by the Taliban or by Sayyaf, actually, but by a group of tribes in that area. And then when the Taliban conquered that area several months later, they inherited them. Sayyaf's own position on Osama is that Osama has changed and he deviated from what he was doing before. I don't know. But at any rate, one point you make about that is accurate. That is to say, there was no special relation between Osama and the Taliban as opposed to other parts of the Mujahideen, of the former Afghan Mujahideen. The Taliban had maybe less of a relationship with him than some other parts of the Mujahideen. But at the same time, when he first came there, he was there to support their struggle, and only gradually under the influence, particularly of the Egyptians led by Ayman al-Zawahiri, did he develop his doctrine of global jihad. And I've never known, just as does the Taliban have not supported global jihad, Sayyaf has also not supported global jihad. On TAPI is the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline primarily for natural gas, though there could also be parallel pipelines for oil. And it's a project. Originally, it was just Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, which has been talked about since the 1990s. I don't follow it closely to be able to give you a definitive judgment, but I believe that a feasibility study has been finished by the Asian Development Bank, and it is slowly advancing. It was still a long way from implementation, and I don't know if it will be implemented, but it's not dead yet.
Okay, gentleman over here.
Thanks a lot for your presentation. I was wondering, considering Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, the relatively wanton use of drones, and a whole variety of other issues concerning the geopolitics in this area. Do you think that the United States, Canada, has any possibility of some of these actions being recognized as war crimes? And I'm interested in the context of whether you think the ongoing release through WikiLeaks of a whole variety of backed up information that we might be seeing greater scrutiny around that in the future?
Well, I'm not sure if you're asking me about U.S. actions or if you're asking me about how international justice functions. Okay. I'm quite sure that Americans have committed war crimes in Afghanistan, at least, and several people have been convicted for them, and I'm sure there are others who have not been convicted for them. also in Iraq and elsewhere. The way, of course, very few people are convicted of war crimes in any country, and even fewer by the international system of justice. As far as WikiLeaks is concerned, there is a lot of interesting information in there, including at least one cable where I myself am mentioned. That's not one of the more interesting ones, by the way. But I don't recall there being much information about war crimes in WikiLeaks. And I think that the type of activities that you are referring to, in particular the drone program, information about those programs is kept on systems at a much higher level of classification than the ones that were exposed by WikiLeaks.
Okay, we'll have a couple more questions.
Dr. Rubin, thank you very much for your talk. I have actually an interesting question. I think Saudi Arabia has funded a lot of the insurgency. They're fighting against ISIS now, but they never really actually took action in Afghanistan. And they're funding a lot of the Taliban. Why is the United States not reacting more forcefully with the Saudis in terms of what they do to really stir trouble all in that region?
Well, in my time in government, I never really saw any evidence that Saudi Arabia was funding the Taliban. There were some individuals in Saudi Arabia and other countries who were funding the Taliban. And actually, in the course, I visited Saudi Arabia quite a few times, mostly in order to discuss with them and Afghan representatives the possibility of a political settlement. But often I was accompanied by other officials who were working on stopping terrorist funding. And the Saudi attitude toward that had changed quite dramatically after the kingdom was itself attacked by al-Qaeda in 2003, 2004, I forget the exact dates. And they actually cracked down on financing much more than before. They openly admitted that they had a problem with Hajj. I don't mean they considered Hajj a problem. Hajj is very much a matter of pride to them, but part of their pride is that any Muslim in the world can come for Hajj, whether he or she is on a sanctions list or is supposed to be detained or somewhere anywhere. They have a policy of safe conduct for any Muslim carrying out Hajj, and they have also noted an exception to all UN sanctions resolutions, including denials of travel, which is they cannot deny any Muslim the right to travel to Saudi Arabia for the sake of Hajj or Umrah, which is pilgrimage outside of the period of Hajj. And that means there is a lot of uncontrolled travel by tens of millions of people going in and cash transfers. And we had quite a few discussions with them about how to control that, but I never saw any evidence during my time in government that they were actively supporting those things. What I see more is that the government of Saudi Arabia is very much a government of the ruling family, which is a tribal family. It is not under very clear centralized control. There are many multimillionaires in that ruling family. All of their finances are not shall we say, fully transparent, and therefore there is potential for a lot of leakage and individual activity. And the capacity of the Saudi government actually to exercise control is rather weak. And at the moment, they are very much overextended because of the accumulation of multiple crises in the region around them, from Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Syria. And at the moment, I don't see much evidence of their being very active at all in Afghanistan or even in Pakistan because they are just so overstretched within the Arab world.
We just have time for one question, but I just wanted to remind everyone that we're having a reception downstairs on the ground floor, so please do join us, and if we don't get to any of your questions, you'll be able to catch Barney there. So.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. I have two questions. The first question is that President Obama spoke twice in two occasions when it is with respect to withdrawing American troops from Afghanistan. And he uses that, the reason is that if he's not concerned about the American interest, he would have withdrawn the troops immediately. You're aware of that, right? Two occasions. So my question is that, is the United States now believing that the American interest in Afghanistan is well protected even after the NATO troops withdrawn? So that's the first question. And yes, also, I really don't know what that American interest really is. Could you be a little more specific and more substantial about what the American interest in Afghanistan is? The second question is that in the journal, the magazine, Monthly Review, in 2001, I think the first article was published the same as in September. The author is David Carr. He's a professor at the University of, I believe it's Colorado. What that article is about is that Professor Carr was disputing an article advanced earlier by two academics, saying that the Americans were very, very reluctant, really very reluctant to get into European politics, especially the European Union. That's the European Union politics. In that article, is well footnoted, was a very, very surprising, because even a monthly review, most of the articles hardly include footnotes. That one to have over 60 footnotes.
What's the question?
Okay, Dr. Carr, Professor Carr was saying that, on the contrary, the Americans up to 2001 were very, very eager to get into European politics and want to gain control away from the European Union people. So, and immediately after 9/11, in one fell swoop, President Bush was able to get the European Union powers to toe the line, to fall in line with that.
Okay. So
the second one is that in the second...
That was three already.
Okay,
no. We've got the European Union and how he was able to get them to toe the line. And the next one was, what are the American interests in Afghanistan?
Yes.
And that's two.
Okay, because the gentleman talked about the TAPI. I'm not too sure whether. Because 2 months after that article, also published in the Monthly Review, there was a text of, I think, the Occidental Oil Company, a presentation to the Foreign Affairs Committee of the United States, arguing the importance of American must gain control, at least, of economic control of Afghanistan, because the pipeline for transporting oil from the former in the Caspian Sea region to over there. So I don't know whether that is...
Okay, we'll deal with all those three issues, because that is a very common concern. That was the war actually about oil. And secondly, the question was dealing with how the European Union towed the line. And thirdly, what are American interests in Afghanistan and how are they going to protect them going forward?
The only interest the United States has in Afghanistan, which would lead it to send tens of thousands of troops and spend over $100 billion a year there, was to try to prevent it from becoming a safe haven for terrorists who would attack the territory of the United States. Now, the United States has many other interests there and elsewhere in the world in stability, in enabling the countries of the region to develop economic ties from which the United States would inevitably benefit as well as the world economy improved, of improving the flow of commodities through the area, of tackling the problem of the spread of narcotics and many other things, and to some extent, human rights, women's rights, develop all of those positive things. None of those would lead the United States to devote the type of resources that it has to Afghanistan. As far as the oil is concerned, that's the same pipeline that the other gentleman's question was about, which he referred to as TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, now India pipeline. And if the United States' main goal were to build that pipeline, all it needed to do was sign an agreement with the Taliban. It didn't need to overthrow them because they were totally willing to agree on that pipeline. And that would have been much cheaper than spending $1 trillion on a war. And they would never get $1 trillion of oil out of that. As far as getting the European Union to toe the line, after the United States was attacked on September 11th, the Atlantic Council of NATO, which is the governing body of NATO, the representatives of all the member states, for the first time invoked Article 5 of NATO, which is the Common Defense Article, and offered to make the war in Afghanistan into a NATO operation in solidarity with the United States. And the Bush administration refused that offer because they did not want to lose control of the military operation to NATO. So rather than accept the cooperation offered by the European states, they preferred to exercise leadership of the military operation themselves. Later, after the invasion of Iraq, they found that they needed more assistance in Afghanistan because so many forces had been diverted to Iraq. And European countries who had opposed the war in Iraq, I believe, I'm sorry for my ignorance, but I cannot recall Canada's position on the war in Iraq at the time.
Actually, we didn't join the coalition of the willing.
Canada also didn't join it. Canada was among those many countries who are members of NATO who nonetheless wanted to show a degree of solidarity with the United States by contributing forces and resources to Afghanistan, even though they were not willing to go into Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank SFU's Community Engagement Unit, Hall, thank Barnett Rubin for coming all the way here and offering his expertise. There are many more questions. We want to know about Narendra Modi. We want to know about like a whole bunch of things. But he will be in the meeting room, and there will be a reception, so you're free to ask questions there. And thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate you coming out and hearing what he has to say.